Hello and welcome to Comic Culture. I'm Terrence Stollard, a professor in the Department of Mass Communication at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. My guest today is artist Rick Leonardi. Rick, welcome to Comic Culture.
Well, thank you for having me. It's wonderful.
Rick, you are known, I guess, as one of the best storytellers in comics with a career that spanned, I don't want to say how many decades, but at least going back to the 1980s. You know, as you are looking at your body of work, working on a title maybe like Cloak and Dagger or Amazing Spider-Man, to the work that you're doing recently at DC Comics with Batman, what sort of progression do you see in your ability to tell a story and how you've applied the tricks along the way?
As I get further into the career, I start to toy with the idea of teaching storytelling. And I've done seminars and I've gone to various institutions of higher learning and tried to convey some of the stuff. And I find that so much of what I've learned is now sort of instinctive, and I can't exactly articulate why I make the decisions I make anymore. So, but yeah, at basis, the founding principle is really to always remember that as a penciler, your job is to kind of stand between the writer and his white hot moment of inspiration and the reader who wasn't there when that happened, who has no clue what's going on, hasn't got the script in front of them, and may very well be new to the title. So you have to put yourself in the position of that reader and walk that reader into the book and through the book from one panel to the next, leading him by the hand, and try not to confuse them. That's basically the job.
And you know, a lot of people will think of the art side of a penciler, where they're thinking about how well something is rendered. And I see a lot of modern comics where the artist has really put together a beautiful image, but not necessarily a clear story or a compelling story, and maybe one where the characters don't have that life, that acting doesn't seem to ring true. And that's something that you've been able to convey through your figures. And when you are laying out a page, how much of it is perhaps a design, and how much of it is how can these characters best tell the story?
That's exactly kind of an endemic problem, and it is worsening over time, because I think a lot of the lore is getting lost, especially at the editorial level. But yeah, allied to what I was saying just a minute ago, pose is part of characterization. Facial expression, obviously, but also fighting style, the way the characters interact. All these things feed into each character's individuality. The smart penciler uses all that and keeps it in, top of mind. Nightwing doesn't fight the way Batgirl does, and so on and so on. Spider-Man has totally different body shape, totally different, possibilities in terms of folding him up and triple jointing him than, say, Superman does. I'm about to start a Superman card set. I'm actually fairly dreading it because there's just not that much you can do with him. It's like, he's Superman. You can't bend him over. You can't fold him over like you can Spider-Man, for example. These are all the kinds of things that come into play as a penciler that sort of escape, I think, that first blush impression that people have of the job. It isn't, unfortunately, it isn't drawing just the first thing that pops into your head. Alas, there are rules and there are restrictions.
When you are when you're starting a new assignment, how much time, if any, do you spend sort of getting to know the characters or the way that you wish to draw them, whether it's researching what someone else has done or just kind of maybe doing some sketching to get the feel for what Wolverine should be like when you're drawing his, face out of costume, so that way you can be true to yourself and also true to what the audience is expecting?
I've always envied those pencilers who appear to have a wealth of planning sketches and studies and stuff like that. Unfortunately, I kind of dive right in and figure it out as I go along. And usually that's a function, frankly, of the shortness of time that's available. I'd love to sort of dub around and work out the finer details, but usually don't have the time for it. What you wind up in the end, in my case, is you wind up with long boxes of comics that you've produced, and these little shorter boxes of 3x5 layouts for each book. Each book each page has a 3x5 little piece of sketch paper with the plan for it. And those short boxes are far more precious to me than the long boxes are now. So that's where all the thinking is.
You know, I spoke once to Lee Weeks, who talked about sometimes you work on a drawing so much you kind of snuff the magic out of it. There's that loss of spontaneity as you kind of push to get something the way that you think it should go versus that initial 3x5 thumbnail sketch that you might have been doing. So how do you kind of balance between that spontaneity on that small sheet of paper to something that's going to be drawn, what, 10x15, and then eventually, you know, inked and published?
Oh, that's a tough question. A lot of times I think that actually, you know, explains a big portion of why those short boxes of planning sketches are more valuable to me than the finished product. But I do have a rule as far as the thumbnails go. I mean, if I'm working on a panel and I can't figure out how to do it, you know, if I've been attacking a panel the same way with the same sort of camera angle and the same view, the same distance from the subject matter, and I can't quite get it to work after 3 to 5 attempts, if I've been scrubbing it out furiously. After the 5th attempt, it's time to start over. Just move the camera someplace else and do something else. I think overwork is always a danger. It's hard really to, if you got the time to overwork a panel, to overwork an entire book, for example, in comic books, you're probably doing it wrong, because this is all about volume, you know, over produced in a very short period of time. I tell the kids I do lessons for, I always tell them your best drawing is going to be your next drawing. So move on. You know, if it comes to that, you can actually just take the drawing that you've been working on and crumple it up, force yourself to crumple it up, throw it over your shoulder and start over. That's the way to break out of preciousness.
You know, you're talking about preciousness, and this is, I've noticed over the past 20 years or so, maybe going back to the 90s, where the new hot artists would come in and they would have a book that would sell 1 million copies, let's say, and they couldn't get a book done on time because they were putting in so much detail and overworking and so much hatching and whatnot. So as someone who has a career going back to the 80s, again, at Marvel, where you are hitting those deadlines or you're not getting a paycheck, how do you sort of, you know, look at what somebody is doing versus making sure that you're able to get 22 pages done in a month and still be satisfied with what's on that page?
When I first interviewed at Marvel back in January of 1980, I was shown, one of the stops I made as I was making a tour of the bullpen was John Romita Sr.'s studio. He had a little office off to the side. He was the art director at the time, so he had his own little lair. And I was shown in there, and he said, "Kid, these are okay." He was looking at my stuff. The secret to success, though, in this business is in any kind of any kind of 5 to 7 panel page, any kind of grid of that sort that you're working on, and they're going to be, you know, that's going to be your rule, basically, 5 to 6, 7 page panel. Only one of those panels should be a stretch for you. Only one of those panels should be some sort of artistic reach. The rest of the panels on the page should be repertory panels, is what he called them. They should be panels that you can do in your sleep, you can knock off. They're almost reflexive, you know, 2 shots, foreground, background, conversational shots. Maybe a silhouette just for fun. Only one panel on the page should be a test for you of any artistic merit or ability. Otherwise, you're just going to get bogged down. It's gonna eat you alive. If every panel on the page is some sort of fight, you're going to be there all day. So that was his rule, and I've tried to stick with it. My Shooter, almost it was a later interview with Shooter, but Shooter used the word facility. And I never quite figured out till much later what he meant by that. But I think what he meant was simply being able to flash through, 2 or 3 or 4 panels before finding one that might be a little bit of a reach or a stretch. And to the extent I've been able to kind of internalize those sorts of rules and live by them, I'm still alive 45 years later, but it's tough.
It's funny because I think about my own work in television, and in those early days, I will tell you, I was a bit of a doofus to those around me, especially if they had criticism, critique, something that they thought they were helping me with. I might be resistant to that. And it wasn't until years later that you start to see there was merit in what those people were saying, and perhaps you should slow down and give pause and think about those kind of words. So as the young artist going into Marvel and hearing something from John Romita, how much of it is, yeah, old man, I'm not going to listen to you, and how much of it is, wow, this is Buddha up on the top of the hill, and I'm going to listen to what this guru is telling me?
Well, it was John Romita Sr., and I kind of worship the man. So, yeah, there are examples of that. Now, I don't know, this is probably apocryphal, but Shooter, again, loves to tell the story about Frank Miller, when Frank Miller first broke into the comics. And everyone, of course, knows him for his panel layouts and his groundbreaking storytelling and all that kind of stuff from Daredevil onward. But there's an appreciable body of work that Miller produced that was quite a bit more conventional, with Shooter looking over his shoulder and making sure that he was internalizing the basics, getting the rules right before he went out and broke them, which is the way Shooter characterizes it. You got to know the rules before you break them. And could be a pile of rubbish, but it's a good story. And there's a lesson in there too. Yeah, you do have to know the rules. You do have to know fundamentals of storytelling. You do have to internalize that idea that you're the advocate for the reader. If you don't feel the reader's bafflement looking at what you've done, if you're not conscious that you've just lost your audience going from panel A to panel B to panel C because you've done something wild and artistic, you're just not doing the job right.
What happens to the young artist when suddenly the editors want you on their book? And not just any book, maybe it's The Amazing Spider-Man when they're bringing in this new costume that's going to be obviously boosting sales, or when the writer of the X-Men says, I want you on the team. How do you sort of keep your head from swelling and make sure that you're not panicking that I've got to deliver the goods, or else, next week I'm going to be doing the back of the cereal boxes?
The rule of Shooter always promulgated. I'm amazed at how often his name is coming up in this interview. But he always used to say that, we don't need you to be, better than our worst guy. We need you to be as good as our best guy. So, when you get invited onto a book like the X-Men, and the reason I was invited onto the X-Men at all was because Marvel had gone to that double time schedule in the summertime. They're putting out X-Men's every 2 weeks instead of every month. So it was a 15-issue year basically, and Mark Silvestri was there's no way he could do that. So that opened the door to a lot of noobs like me to come in and knock off the occasional X-Men. That said, that was a pretty fast track, and you had to have your best shoes on, and no fooling around. Get going. I got lucky too in that this opened the door to a lot of inkers who otherwise wouldn't have had X-Men exposure. So P. Craig Russell, Kent Williams did that wonderful X-Men job, and I got. Who else? Bill Sienkiewicz inked a New Mutants of mine. Bill Sienkiewicz, come on. So with that kind of crowd, you really had to bring your A game, and you knew it. So not that hard, really. With traveling that company, you don't slouch. You just stand up straight and do your work.
It's funny because your career, like we've said, and I hate to keep going back to the 80s, but it goes back to the 80s. You've been working pretty much nonstop that length of time. So as flavors change and audiences may get tired of an artist, you hear about the rising star who burns out after 3 or 4 years. How do you sort of maintain the discipline to keep working on a book month after month, year after year, still getting the pages done, but also making sure that newer readers, when they come in, aren't going to think that you are either not the right fit for what they're looking for or not too much of an old fogey?
Two answers to that. One is, and there's an interesting cross-check of this. It goes back to this issue of storytelling. Readers, at the end of the day, yeah, they want flashy page design and some, dazzling rendering, but they also want to understand the story. And to the extent that you're able to tell the story in such a fashion that they're satisfied with it and not confused by it, I think there's always going to be a market for you. The way to check that, or the way that I've seen it sort of demonstrated over time, is the occasional editor will call up and ask for your help in thumbnailing out someone else's pencils, because that someone else can draw like a dream, amazing, but can't tell a story. And he needs a little help. He needs a little touch up. So I've had that happen more than once, and it kind of demonstrates to me, I think, that there's two skill sets, and the one that's really more important is that storytelling skill set. In answer to the question of am I getting stale or too old for the job, that's it's possible. This Death in the Family Robin Lives thing, the editor concerned was explicit in saying that they were looking for a retro look. They were looking for, somebody who could hark back to the Aparo days. So yeah, I may be approaching a kind of an emeritus status here, whether I want to or not. So it happens. It's bound to happen sooner or later.
Well, I certainly wasn't implying that you had entered that stage, but it is interesting when an editor is looking for someone with that retro look, and it is an iconic book. Is there, Death in the Family is one of those books that is sort of, for a comic fan, the death of Robin, Jason Todd at the hands of the Joker, the victim of a 1-800 number, and apparently only by a few hundred votes. Stepping into that storyline now, 30 some odd years later, is there any intimidation? I know you are a professional who's been doing this for a bit, but is there intimidation looking at this and saying, man, I've got some big shoes to fill?
Not so much that. I was dead curious to see what they were going to do with it, though. It's a what if story, but it's a what if story with a big difference. Because it does answer a kind of a fairly pointed question. It's like, what if you, the readership, had voted the other way? Would you, what would the result have been, and would you be satisfied with it? So there was I think there was a real opportunity to tell a story that it wasn't just kind of like a what if, could be, could not be, whatever. Whatever story we told here would in fact be in a weird kind of way canon. This is what would have happened if they'd gone the other way. This is not just some random tree branch. This is an actual large tree branch here. So I was kind of curious just how ambitious they were going to be with it. In the end, I think DC played it safe and wound up with a kind of a palatable ending from the corporate point of view, in the sense that the wheel turned, balance is restored, there's always going to be a Batman, there's always going to be a Joker. Okay, I guess I could sort of see that. Spoilers if you haven't read it. Unfortunately, I think they kind of missed an opportunity to do something really different and quite a bit more interest. So, my feeling. I have a much longer story to tell about this, much longer impression to share if we have time, but leave it at that for right now. So.
Well, one thing that has changed over the course of time with comics is that modern artists are not necessarily working on boards with ink. They might be working on screens with pixels. And I'm wondering if you are still the traditionalist working on the Bristol board, or if you've made that move over and maybe you're using Procreate or Clip Studio or something like that.
Without getting too tedious, I have a kind of a hybrid approach. And I'll still do thumbnails like these on pieces of paper with a pencil, and then I'll take those and blow them up to 11 by 17. Light box them onto an actual piece of Bristol board, pencil the page in the traditional way. Then back to the machines, what I'll do is I'll feed the pencil original through a Kinko's copier, an industrial copier, and copy that pencil black line onto another piece of Bristol board, and that will serve as sort of the ground, as the ground of my ink, so-called. I'll go back into that with brush or pen and trick out the larger black areas and clean up a lot of the artifact that is the result of the copying process. But that results in what I will call an inked original. That in turn will get scanned and made into a file in Procreate, and then I'll clean that up even further and do even more modifications in Procreate. And Procreate will allow you to do screen effects. It'll allow you to, something I do fairly frequently is chop heads off, shrink them down, blow them up, because my proportions are usually wrong. So yeah, there's all kinds of digital stuff, digital trickery that's available in that last final step. But what winds up getting sent to DC is a file and not a piece of Bristol board. From the collector's market, it makes things interesting because now there's going to be a pencil original of the page and an inked original of the page. And this digital file, it may look nothing like it. So not my lane, not my problem.
Well, you know, it brings up a couple of, to me, interesting points. One is that this seems like it's a lot more work than it was, 20 years ago, when maybe you just had to sit there and erase a little bit and maybe paste a new head on.
Yeah, and sort of pass it off to the inker and let the inker kind of, save your bacon, which happened more times than I care to admit. Yeah, I went into it for sure with the attitude that this is going to be some sort of big time saver, but it's not. The process, I've essentially cut out an inker, for example, in that the Canon machine down at my local Kinko's is taking my pencil original and making a black and white version of it on a fresh piece of Bristol. So there goes the inker's paycheck right there. That's sad to me in a way, because one of the great things about the traditional way of working, where you had an inker to resort to, was that you got that inker's second point of view on everything. And in the best of worlds, that inker is an artist himself or herself with as much stature as your own, and you wound up with a hybridized result that was stronger than the original. Doesn't happen so much anymore. Inkers are hard to come by, and as you say, everybody's working digitally.
Conventions are a huge part of, I guess, the income for an artist, especially because you can go and sell an original page. So is this something that you're able to kind of flip, like, hey, here's the pencil, and then hey, here's the ink, and then let's not look at the issue that we can see the differences between the two?
I'm finding that the tide that's running in the other direction, now that we have, now that you look at it and say to yourself, well, you have two streams of originals now to pick from if you're a collector. That's true. On the other hand, there are so many people now who are working entirely digitally that, in fact, there's less and less original art, physical original art, on the market. It's driving up prices to ridiculous heights, and it's caused me actually to exit the market entirely. I don't know how to price these things. I'm not making original art that I care to part with at this point, either because I've inked it, I don't really like it, or it's older stuff that was inked in the traditional way, and I'm having less and less of it, and I'm certainly not getting any more of it. So I'm just going to hang on to what I've got. So sorry about that, but original art, if you want to sketch, that's one thing, but original art, it's hard to come by.
Well, Rick, they are telling us that we are out of time. I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk with me today.
Well, it was a pleasure.
And I'd like to thank everyone at home for watching Comic Culture. We will see you again soon.